likes to brag about how rich and successful he is, that much you know. But as we've learned, his businesses, they've declared bankruptcy half a dozen times, and the New York Times got a hold of 10 years worth of his tax returns, and they show he managed to lose more than $1 billion over that period. In fact, he was literally the biggest loser in the U.S. if you follow that trend over that period. My next guest, he's been following Trump for decades, and he says the Donald lied to him about his wealth to get onto the Forbes 400 list, and, as they say, he has the tapes to prove it. Here's one of them, where he says Trump himself called the reporter, but didn't identify himself as to who he really was, but in fact pretended to be a Trump organization official named John Barron. Take a listen for yourself.
Let me tell you what the deal is, just so you understand. Mr. Trump bought, first of all, most of the assets have been consolidated to Mr. Trump, because you have down Fred Trump, and I'd like to talk to you off the record if I can, just to make your thing easier.
Okay, sure.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, but I think you can really use Donald Trump now, and you can just consolidate. I think last year somebody showed me the article, and I think you had 200 and 200, and really it's been pretty well consolidated now for the most part.
Investigative journalist Jonathan Greenberg, he was on the other end of that call, and he joins us now. Jonathan, thanks for a few minutes.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, I want to get into what he did, but I want to start backwards and ask why. Was he doing it to keep the facade going so investors would keep the money coming in, or, not to put you on the couch here, was this out of insecurity that it was really important for him to tell everybody how rich he was, even if obviously the balance sheet didn't add up?
Well, the answer is both, Richard. I mean, it's a great question. I've interviewed thousands of people in my life. I mean, I started with Malcolm Forbes, the Forbes 400 in 1982. We first came out, and I was the real estate assessor. And I've interviewed thousands of people over the years. I've never in my life met someone as insecure as Donald Trump. He literally used the Forbes 400. We started him at 100 million and his father at 100 million. He was worth less than $5 million that year. He should not have been on the Forbes 400 in the first place. But through his bullying and intimidation and cajoling and deceit, he borrowed money against this mythology of his business success, which was and when that mythology began to crack in 89 and 90, as the news story I wrote in the Washington Post last week revealed, he went after those people who were in the best position to tell the truth about what an abysmal and monumental failure he was and has always been as a businessman.
And we're going to get into the pattern here and also the methodology, but it's always dangerous, I think, to do alternative realities. But if you step it out, I don't think it's a leap to say if the myth of Trump being one of the 400 richest men in America wasn't established, it never ends up having the reality TV career as being this business magnate, which then doesn't beget the presidential run and then the presidency. He really couldn't have gotten to where he is now if that myth wasn't created and perpetuated eventually on TV.
That's absolutely true, Richard. What the new story shows, what really amazed me, as I talked to the reporters who I knew from those years, from 30 years ago, I learned that there was even more intimidation. And the reason for the additional intimidation was that in 1995 and 1996, after he had gone bankrupt with his casinos, fleeced the banks and financial advisors who had loaned him $3 billion, lost all of that except for a few, hundreds of millions for payouts. In 95 and 96, he took his companies public and raised $500 million and $1.3 billion in junk bonds, which eventually were entirely worthless, worth less than 5 cents on the dollar 12 years later. And I looked at it and I said, wait a minute, where were these casino analysts? Where was the Wall Street Journal? Where was Forbes? Where were the documentaries about Trump talking about his other failure 5 years earlier, while the public, investors, you were investing in this Trump mythology and brand? And it shows how he silenced his critics through bullying, intimidation, lies, and threats.
And just for people today who don't realize the significance, if you go back, particularly to the 80s, to be on the Fortune 400 was a huge deal. It was the seal of approval that you were a hitter. And this is before really you had the digital media, obviously, et cetera. And that was really, the imprimatur that you've made it. To that end, let me fast forward to 1990, because as you detail in the piece, he completely hustled in terms of the financials that he put forward. Forget even the phone calls. All the alarms that should have gone off weren't. But then we get to 1990, Jonathan. This is the part that I'm still gobsmacked on. He's been exposed. By now they know this is a hustle. These casinos aren't worth a fraction. All the liquidity he says he has, he doesn't have. How did somehow, some way, he not only get a piece killed about him, but also he's getting back on the list that he's a cash positive guy and that he's still a major player?
There was a period of 6 years that that Forbes took him off the Forbes 400 based upon the fact that he had a net worth of below zero. But that's part of his evil genius, if you will. Truth is like kryptonite to Donald Trump, and truth tellers are arch enemies of Donald Trump because they interfere with the mythology of his success. Let's look at the Forbes cover in May 1990 by my friends, Dick Stern and John Connolly, that said that was going to have a cover line, "Is Trump broke?" With the answer, yes, he is worth less than zero. They did an interview with him on Monday to just say the story's coming out, here's what it's saying. He said, "I will sue you." And then Jim Michaels, the most legendary business editor of the 20th century, my former editor, great editor, was pressured by Trump and told them in a shouting match, you can't say that he's worth less than zero. You have to come up with a net worth of $500 million and find a way to justify those numbers. And the story's due tonight. This is on Tuesday, which was totally out of character with Forbes magazine and Jim Michaels. Now, what John Connolly remembers is that Trump threatened to expose Malcolm Forbes for bringing underage drinking male companions into the Plaza Bar. And according to Trump's threat, when they called Trump and Trump said, no, you can't let him drink, Malcolm Forbes called him the next day and said, this is outrageous, called Donald Trump and said, I'm going to get you back. I'm going to assign people to a hatchet job, and they're going to tell things that aren't true about you. And therefore, Forbes backed down and did what it never did, changed the story, told the writer to support these false facts in order to not be embarrassed by Donald Trump. Malcolm Forbes had been dead 3 months when this threat was supposedly made, when this incident happened. And so Trump knew that Malcolm Forbes couldn't sue him for slander. It was a ridiculous story. And yet it got Forbes to change the cover line and the facts of the story. And then 4 months later, Trump went ahead and put it in his book. And when Forbes took him off the Forbes 400, said, this is why they took me off the Forbes 400. So Trump has always known that there's an audience who might research, and there's also an audience which is the larger public. And that's why he got a documentary killed. He had a casino analyst fired from his job. He had Neil Barsky at the Wall Street Journal, the best Trump reporter in the world, reassigned because he entrapped him by giving him boxing tickets to Atlantic City and then making up a story about Neil Barsky. But I do believe that he has inflated his net worth since that time. Tim O'Brien found that in his book and was sued by saying he was only worth $150 to $250 million when Trump said he was worth $3 billion. I believe it's still, going on today. I mean, the way to know that Trump is lying is that his lips are moving.
I think there's a risk that people out there say, okay, he's a megalomaniac, he's insecure, it's important to put up this facade. But people got hurt in the process, not just the people whose careers he ruined, but all those investors, because they had a reason to believe, hey, if Forbes prints it, if nobody in the analyst community is calling him out on it, he must really have the Midas touch and will invest. People got hurt here, Jonathan.
Oh, the investors, I mean, that stock went from $35 to, less than 20 cents. Imagine if you were one of those investors, those junk bonds, the funds that brought them and, the people that bought them as investors and the Trump Taj Mahal got completely wiped out. His public company went through 2 bankruptcies. And what's astonishing is, as he was scamming and burning these people, he was sucking money out of the company, so that even afterwards, the man has no shame. He said, actually, I did very well with taking the Trump casinos public.
The answer I still am waiting for and I haven't seen is, why, when no bank would lend this guy a dime, why did Deutsche Bank keep floating this guy loans? Now, I know there's a lot of innuendo, rumor, but it doesn't make sense. They knew better and they kept on doing it. Do we know why?
So you come from a financial background, Richard. I think we both have some, some fluency in financial markets and lenders. The interesting thing is, and boy, I've really thought of that's a really important question. And the answer to that question is that it wasn't really Deutsche Bank. Citibank loaned him money for the Trump shuttle. That was Citibank's money. 1989. They loaned him $350 million for something that, basically they lost most of their money on. That was bank funding. Deutsche Bank was private equity, these shadow agencies that Deutsche Bank has paid billions of dollars in fines for doing, by the way. And who owned these? Well, these offshore accounts that are virtually untraceable. Who is putting their billions of dollars in these offshore accounts that are untraceable? Russian oligarchs. That's why this business of Russia did not begin in 1996 with the taping of stuff in Trump Tower. I mean, Trump Tower was being watched because the Russian oligarchs, some of their real estate funds were there. But the money from Russia was flowing into Trump through Deutsche Bank, and they were the only people willing to lend to him. And it wasn't the bank, Richard. It was the private equity groups in these deals that were entirely untraceable, remain untraceable to this day, lending him money, mostly for money laundering, because, you own this real estate, you own these multi-million-dollar apartments, you fund this, you have these loans, and even if they're not worth $100 million for a $100 million investment over time, you're able to bring that currency and those assets into the United States and use them.
It has been, honestly, some of the most compelling reading, and I cannot suggest people check it out enough here, the series that Jonathan Greenberg's put together. Jonathan, thank you for a few minutes. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Richard. Thank you for having me on.
Up next, the first Democratic debate. It's now just 5 days away. Joe Biden still leading in the polls, but he's also in the middle of some controversies, mostly of his own making. We're going to take a look at where he stands and where Donald Trump stands against some of those same Democrats, including Joe Biden.